welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your jiggle like jello host, Madelyn.
I'm your 8 feet tall. I'm not host Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. It's Emma's side quest.
Yeah.
So what's the dealio? What are we talking about?
This week, as I say, from 8 feet in the air.
It's crazy that her mic's set up. Like, you wouldn't believe it.
This week we're talking about sexiness in games.
Ooh.
Which I'm sure you're saying, that's very nebulous, Emma.
Yeah.
Which it sure is. You're right. It is a very nebulous topic, and I think it will probably be a somewhat nebulous discussion that we end up having around
That's kind of the trademark here.
It is, you're right. So there's some big things that inspired this, but I just want to get like the small thing out of the way first. I've been playing Unicorn Overlord, which you'll hear more about in 2 weeks, I guess, which is the new tactics RPG from Vanillaware. And one of like Vanillaware's hallmarks in their games is they always have at least one female character design that's just absurd, right? In body proportion. Generally in the chest area. In 13 Sentinels, I found this somewhat comical because the character who it is has like 2 sort of alter egos or 2 sort of main outfits that they're in. And in her sort of civilian outfit, she's like emphasizing her chest, right? And then in her like super secret agent outfit, she's emphasizing her butt. So it's like horny Superman Clark Kent situation. Which I do think is funny. But anyway, one of the characters, because there are so many Unicorn Overload characters, there are several that have been hit with the breasted boobily curse of Vanillaware. But the first one you meet is called Scarlet, and I just encourage you to look this up. Just like Scarlet Unicorn Overlord, her key art looks fine, right? Just like the illustration of her. But her sprite work in the game, something about the shading or the line art just really makes it look like her breasts are not attached to her body, like at the top. And it's usually I see these and I'm like, oh ho ho, you know, it's the Vanillaware girl. And this I'm like, I feel uncomfortable looking at her in like a body horror way.
I can confirm. There's something like it looks like she has no breasts and she's like put some like bowling balls there.
Yes.
Because it doesn't make, like you were like saying in our little like comment thread about it, it's like, oh, like her little like corset dress thing is like being a push-up, but it's like not even the right place to really be doing that in the way that it looks either. Yeah. So it's just like she's put some round things in there.
Yes. It really, I do not like it. But probably the main thing is this sort of, if you've been on Twitter at all, why have you been there? In addition to the porn bots that comment on every single post now.
If you've been on Twitter at all, you've experienced sort of virtual... Yeah.
There's a bit of a like discussion, sort of fake culture war happening around the game Stellar Blade, which comes out like next week, I think.
By the way, I just have to enter into the record that learning that Stellar Blade is not even out yet was just shocking and horrifying to me.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's the next like big like Sony exclusive thing that they've partnered with a Korean company. They're called Shift Up. It's an action type game with a main character whose name is Eve, who is very sexy, or is designed to be very sexy. She has like ponytail, she has like various skin tight or revealing outfits that she can wear, and she's sort of running and jumping around in these. So it's meant to be sort of sort of, I guess, Bayonetta-y, but also sort of like Bayonetta in a Dark Souls sort of way, I think, in terms of combat. Maybe more Devil May Cry-y. Devil May Cry, as we call it here.
Thank you.
And there's just some like discussion that's happened around the main character's Eve design. Also just like the female character design versus the male character design in that game is a little weird. The main guy really looks like he was made by a different character designer than the two main girls. And just a lot of people sort of co-opting the image of Eve for their like petty BS on social media. But it has gotten people talking and me thinking a little bit about like how does what's the common like design parlance of sexiness in a game? Why do you design sexy characters? Is the common understanding of that? Who is that for? Right. I just thought it'd be an interesting topic of conversation.
Well, I feel like it's been something that's, I think particularly with the ongoing and like tidal wave of popularity of Baldur's Gate 3, which is like very much, you talked about Mass Effect in our preparations for this a bit, and it's like, man, like Mass Effect really walked so that Baldur's Gate 3 could run. I mean, not exactly.
They don't have like a Garrus equivalent in Baldur's Gate 3.
You're right.
I was thinking about this because I was like, yeah, there's definitely like a clear line there. Yeah. But
like the
women
menu.
love, well, not just women, but people love Garrus. But yeah, there's not really like Lae'zel, I guess, is the least humanoid, and even she's very humanoid. Thranky is not that like different from a general look. She doesn't have much of a nose. That's sort of the only difference.
People are into that.
Yeah.
The Fallout guy, Like, I just want to throw that out there, game designers. There's an appetite for noseless folks, apparently.
But anyway, I think Garrus is a sort of a good... Garrus from Mass Effect, he's an alien. I've always thought of him as looking kind of fish-like, sort of. But he's like a good counterexample to like the sexiness of like Eve or something, or someone designed like that, in that he's very not like, you don't look at the character Garrus and be like, yeah. Well, some people do.
Yeah. You might not be expected to.
Yes. You wouldn't necessarily be expected to look at Garrus and be like, that guy's sexy, right? But he's a very popular character, and people who love Garrus really love Garrus.
Yeah, I think everything that we say in this episode is going to need that, well, some people do, disclaimer. Okay, yeah. So, like, let's just get that out of the way. And, like, I think we'll say it a lot, too, probably. But just in case, let's assume that pretty much anything we say here also has an unsaid, well, some people do, attached to it.
I actually think the, well, some people do, though, is actually a really important point of underscoring this discussion, though. Because we'll talk a lot about, like, sexy, particularly female character designs that often fall into, like, similar tropes. And those people are designed to be sexy to a particular audience, right? And so if you're designing a broader range of characters that are meant to be attractive, they are targeted at different audiences, right? Your understanding of different audiences. So the fact that, well, some people do is perhaps something that the video game industry, when designing their sexy characters, could actually be thinking about more, right?
Yeah. And I think that ties into like the other sort of recent development in sexy games characters, right? Which is the Hades 2 technical test coming out starting this past week, right? And them sharing a bunch of character art from that. And of course, the Hades character designs are much more in that sort of like, well, some people do. And Hades 2 seemingly even more so than the first one.
Yeah. My hot take, I think the new characters look great. I don't like most of the redesigns.
Wow, so the Aphrodite thing doing just nothing. Everyone's like, Aphrodite.
No. Yeah. That's my hot take. I don't really have anything specific to say about it. I think the new characters look great, but I don't like most of the redesigns.
Heard it here first.
Yeah. We'll see.
Now, Emma is saying that because a consultant told her she had to.
Right. Yeah.
Like, they got neuter, wrong, bad.
I don't think Aphrodite got neuter, to be fair. I don't think it was possible. I don't think... The people were very excited for the new Hades designs. And Hades is a really interesting game that came out in terms of offering a wide variety of different types of attractive characters. No matter what character in that game, there's someone out there who's like, hell yeah. Great. I saw people very excited about the Skelly redesign. Which
I haven't seen the Skelly redesign.
Extremely funny. Somebody out there thinks Skelly, now that's naked, right?
Something to be said about bones there, but I won't. I'm so psyched that Skelly is back. Wow. Okay, let's totally derail. No, just kidding. Okay, do you want to talk about bodies with... Oh, I guess, for games, this is relevant so little. But I think that, we are going to be talking about male and female bodies throughout this. Important thing. Like, male and female as understood in a very, like, gender binary sense. Of course, there are male and female bodies that don't have these body parts or traditional or whatever, and that don't have these body parts, or like understandings of like what are these traits supposed to look like. But given that games can barely represent a diversity of body types in any way, or even a diversity of sexy body types, like even just being like, let's look at attractive body types. Like games can barely do more than like 2 versions of that. So, the idea of like trans bodies or non-binary bodies is just like, there are so few examples of that in games. So do you want to start by talking about boobs, by talking about butts, by talking about muscles? Like, where are we going? What gays are we looking at?
I guess just to return to Stellar Blade, since this sort of started with it. So, Eve is designed in a way, they scanned in just the body of a Korean supermodel, Shin Jae-eun, I think. Which, weird. Feels weird. I think it's so, like, they wanted to make their own, like, face. They didn't want it to actually be her, but there's a promotional element to it. If I'm thinking, like, charitably of being like, oh yeah, you worked with this supermodel. It's her body, right? Because, like, you could just model a supermodel proportion body if you wanted to.
Well, but it adds that outside stamp of approval, right?
Yeah.
Like, you as someone who desires a female body, and, like, particularly you as a man who desires a female body, like, you're allowed, like, this has been deemed hot, right? Adds that extra sheen of authentic sexy to it, because she's a model. Yeah. Who doesn't want to bang a model?
But one point of critique that I think has spoken to me in terms of how I've sort of been looking at Eve's presentation as well, and you pointed this out, of, like, she doesn't really seem aware that she's wearing something that's sexy, right? There was a great article on Inverse about sort of Stellar Blade and all the situation around it, and there was some tweets linked from Gita Jackson, just like saying that she doesn't seem like confident, right? I think the tweets were comparing to like Ariana Grande, which like they have also the high ponytail, wear sort of similar aesthetics, right? And Ariana Grande, when she goes around, she's always like knows that she looks good, right? Yeah. She's comfortable in the clothes she wears. She's confident in the clothes she wears. She exudes that aura as she goes around. Eve doesn't seem to feel particularly anything about the clothes that she's wearing, which isn't like necessarily an indictment. People compare this to Nier Automata a lot, and like I think that's a good example of like 2B and 9S aren't really aware that they're wearing like fetishy type outfits, right? But it's sort of playing with that in terms of like their sort of sexualized appearance versus like their repressed existence versus like the little robot guys, the very non-sexualized little robot guys that are like having orgies and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's doing something with that. And Stellar Blade, because it's not out yet, maybe is doing something with that. But in terms of how it's been talked about, how it's been presented so far, nothing has sort of materialized from that yet. It just seems like she's wearing these clothes for the sake of it, right?
Yeah, that's what I think is one thing that I think is so challenging, interesting about this whole conversation is that, like, no one has played the game, right? Like, the way the developers are talking about it does not make it feel like this is likely to be the case. But, like, it certainly could be that you get into the game and she's like confident and owning her sexuality and whatever. Yeah. But this seems to be more in sort of that vein of the like, not to throw like One Direction under the bus here, right? I think that song is much more like wholesome than the version of this that's like Stellar Blade might be. But, you know, the whole like, oh, she doesn't even know. She doesn't even know that she's sexy, right? Like, yeah. She's just like, she's so hot, but she doesn't know it, right? Which is like childlike in some ways that are, you know, you should think about if that's something for you. Yeah, it's just I don't know. It's whether or not you think that it's like, oh, that she would be wearing this because, you know, like empowered woman, she's not wearing it for men, she's wearing it because it makes her feel good, or whatever. Even if she is wearing it for like the male gaze, right? Yeah. There's a confidence inherent, like you don't put something like that on unless you're like plot wise somehow forced to be wearing it, without knowing that you like look smoking. Yeah. Right. I just think of like like I'm not running around but it's like, you know, you put on something where you look nice and you're like, oh yeah, like I look nice. Yeah. And you wear something like that because you look nice. Yeah. So it is sort of odd when it's like, oh, this character doesn't know that she's walking around looking like fire.
So in terms of like what it is so far, her main like idol animation, apparently she doesn't have very many, just from people playing the demo at least. She doesn't really do very much when she's just standing there. But if she's on a ladder, she'll sort of like bob up and down a little bit. And it is notable. Like I was looking, the Inverse article has a tweet to this linked of like this animation. And it's like her breasts aren't really like jiggling. It's more like they're changing sizes. So mostly from my game developer brain, I guess. Yeah, I was looking
Emma
at it
for this kind of consulting work, by the way. This is exactly what she'd want to be doing.
Exactly. But I was looking at it, I was like, that doesn't seem like that seems like a bug. That seems like it's bugged right now. I don't think her breast should be doing that. The other notable thing about Stellar Blade and Eve is that there is one outfit you can get that's essentially like just like a nude bodysuit, right? And if you wear this, you lose access to like the shield ability that she has. So essentially you're making the game harder for yourself. And there was some discussion from Poppy Wilde, who's a professor at a university, I believe, just saying, like, this seems like on the surface, this seems kind of cool, right? Because, like, the form and function are matching, right? She's wearing less, and so that actually puts her in more danger. But it seems like it's more like, oh, you know, it's like the gamer challenge, right? Can you do it in the nude bodysuit, versus like really saying anything about that. It just like your reward for taking on more challenges. She sort of appears slightly naked, I guess.
See, like, that sort of thing, like, almost bothers me less than some of the rest of it. I'm like, if this took place in a game where I had more trust in, like, seemingly how this portrayal was being handled, like, that's kind of funny, right? Like, that's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And, like, I don't know. I also, like, in researching this episode, I realized I sort of came to the conclusion that, like, some people seem to have a problem just with, like, if there's like an over-sexualized character design, like, that inherently they're like, this is bad and I don't like this. And I think I realized in researching for this that, like, it just doesn't really bother me. Like, what bothers me is when it gets like fan servicey beyond that, right? It doesn't, like, characters wear weird stuff in games all the time. I did see a man in like a 7-belt coat in Spain, and I meant to tell you about it, and I didn't.
An icon.
I know. But, you know, I was going to say, most people don't wear that many belts. Characters wear things that don't make sense in games all the time. And so, like, the existence of overly sexualized female characters, doesn't super bother me, like, on its own, just as character design, or, like, costumes that are implausible. Like, I might point and laugh at it, but it, like, doesn't really impact my enjoyment of the game very much. It's really more like what you're doing with the camera and, like, what that character's existence is like, where it starts to get like, I don't know. This I feel about this in, like, a lot of media. So that's the conclusion I drew as I was working on this. I was like, oh, like, I don't care. I don't like, it doesn't bother me that she looks like this. Some of her costumes are worse. When I watched the like technical demo from the thing, I was like, what are we even getting worked up about? Like, this is nothing.
Right. Yeah.
But some of them are less than that, and so I get it. But yeah, that's like where I also came to the conclusion that, like, man, I just do not play games for this. You know?
Yeah.
Like, this is just not how I interact with games.
Yeah. I put a note at the top that's like, I feel a little out of my depth, because I do feel like the character designs where I'm like, oh, I really like that, are ones where it's like, I wish I could wear that, sort of, versus like, oh, I think they look really attractive or whatever. I guess it's sort of related, but not in like a, I think they're attractive way, more in like a, I like that outfit kind of way. But yeah.
And it is a little hard to untangle how much of that is like, well, like, what percentage of quote unquote sexy characters are like designed for me?
Yeah.
Right? A much lower percentage than of people who are like me playing the game. That's for certain. So that is one thing about that sort of perspective that I think is like, well, like, what would that look like? Right? Like, what there are just not that many games where characters are designed to be like, that's sexy to me.
Yeah.
Like, jiggly boob girl in no clothes is not really, with no personality, is not what I'm looking for. So to be fair, like, maybe if someone would like design a game, I would suddenly come around to be like a leering teenage boy about it. But that's just like not really how I engage with like video game media in particular, and certainly not in like a character design way.
Yeah.
So we're like terrible people to be doing this podcast, basically.
But yeah, just unfortunately around Stellar Blade, and this isn't really the fault of the developers in particular. I know South Korea has a significant problem in its gaming industry around like feminism right now, in that you can be fired for being a feminist in a sort of way at some companies. But I don't think there's anything specific about Shift Up. There are certainly women on the development team. They posted a picture of themselves earlier. But I don't know about that. But there have been a subset of fans sort of coming off of this, like, light Gamergate 2 situation with Sweet Baby Inc., which does consulting on video games for various reasons, just general narrative consulting, of, like, the reject modernity, embrace tradition thing, and using Eve as sort of, like, the tradition thing, and then using pictures of, like, Aloy or Abby or real people in more creepy ways for the modernity or whatever.
Here's my reject tradition, embrace modernity. We were reading these articles about Aloy, and they were like, oh, like, one of the things that the bad people have been like, she's got a beard, right? Because she's got, like, peach fuzz. And here's my reject tradition, embrace modernity. I don't care about it from a, like, femininity perspective. No character needs peach fuzz.
You know what, though? Maybe it's good for that. So there's some gamers out there who, in fact, learn that women have body hair. You know?
Like, sure. Okay, I guess. But I'm still... you won't convince me. I'm standing by my embrace tradition, reject modernity here in saying, like, I reject that modeling realistic peach fuzz is a necessary thing for any game, and that is worth the time and energy that had to have been put into that. Yeah. There I am. That's where I stand with these. I stand with them against peach fuzz for 100% different reasons.
I've seen this a little bit with the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Tifa and Aerith too, in the Eve spot, which is
why aren't their breasts triangles?
Very funny, considering around when they showed Tifa in Remake, these same people were like, they nerfed her breasts.
A sports bra.
She's wearing a sports bra. She has spandex under her skirt. God. The woke police came for Nomura.
Sweet baby Nomura.
They said, sports bra, another belt. But yeah, lots of people being weird about very traditionally attractive female characters because they have peach fuzz or, like, muscles.
I know, that's what's so funny with the Aloy thing, is, like, if you met Aloy in real life, you would sexually harass the hell out of her.
Yeah, she's great. She just looks like a normal person.
Yeah.
A normal, pretty person.
Yeah.
She doesn't wear makeup because it's the post-apocalypse. That's all you've got.
Even that, it's like, she doesn't have, like, acne.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
You know.
Give Aloy realistic acne.
Yeah, cut the peach fuzz budget. Fuzz. Let's get some whiteheads in there.
Yeah. Anyway, you might be saying, why are we talking so much about, female characters here? What about the men? The sexualized men in video games?
Yeah, aren't the men equally unrealistic and sexualized in games, Emma?
The answer is sort of, right? I think in terms of unrealistic, you could maybe say yes, right? But the way that men are presented in games is different than the way women are presented in games. Somewhat around... There was one article, the game developer one, I think, from Josh Beiser, that was just talking a little bit about, like, as a society, we don't interpret as much of a typical male's body as, like, sexual, necessarily. Like, there's not necessarily a problem when men aren't wearing shirts, right? Because that's not, like, an inherently sexual part of their body, right? So, like, looking at a character like Kratos, especially original incarnation Kratos.
Kratos comes up in every single one of these articles,
yeah.
I have to say, which I thought was fascinating. Anyway, continue.
He doesn't wear a shirt. He has a lot of sex. But I would not in any way say that Kratos is, like, for your titillation pleasure, right? He's there so that you can feel like you're cool and shirtless and having sex, right? Particularly if you're a male player, or I guess someone who just wants to be shirtless and having
powerful.
Sex. Yeah.
It's the, many of these articles talk about how, quote unquote sexualized male characters aren't sexualized. They're sexy, maybe, but it's all part of a power fantasy. It's, in so many of these games, you're conquesting in one way or another, and it becomes a thing where you are also powerful in your sexual questing because you're playing as a traditionally attractive and desirable character.
Yeah.
And I think that's, it raised the question for me of like, okay, but like theoretically, like a female, like a sexy female character theoretically could be that too, right?
Yeah.
We could imagine we can't really
a
imagine
lot of people find character like Bayonetta to be that for them, to be fair. So there are examples you could point to in terms of things that have successfully felt like power fantasies for more for feminine people, right? But
I think
certainly not as widespread.
And it's certainly like Bayonetta also is sort of tied up in a queerness and a like alternate sexuality, perhaps, in a way that I think a Kratos and characters like him are not, right? Like if you're identifying with Bayonetta, Bayonetta was, I don't think this is controversial to say, Bayonetta was not made for you, the girls. Like you have maybe reclaimed her, right? And I think that's something that's become more and more baked in to some extent. But like,
although I think Bayonetta 3 was a little bit of a betrayal.
Yes. Yeah. So all this to say that like, while I think, and I was listening to a great Waypoint Radio episode about this too, where they were talking about, oh man, I'm like, what game were they talking about? They were talking about Ivy and Soul Calibur. And an article from Maddie Myers about that. And like, this character, this like overly bizarrely sexualized, and how like queer women, how like Maddie's group of like queer women friends have like come around to being like, yes, girl, like jiggle, basically. And like that's a thing that happens and a thing that people do, but it's important that it's like there's a difference between like you finding like an alternate interpretation of something that is queer or empowering or whatever, and like Kratos in the first 3 God of Wars, where it's like very much this like mainstream male sexuality power fantasy, and so like Kratos having like those crazy muscles is about like your power. It's not about you looking at him, and in fact, if you are looking at him, that is bad, right? Like, if you are making a game where the men are like, you're encouraged to look at the men like you are generally encouraged to look at women, then like, it's time to get some homophobia up in here. So that's, and so anyway, to circle back a little bit, to this idea of like, okay, could you have like an empoweringly, traditionally sexy woman who is using that sexuality for conquest? I just think culturally there's so much more baggage tied up in that, and like what we expect of women's bodies and what it means. If a woman is like sexually powerful or aware of her, I mean, it comes back to the like Stellar Blade woman doesn't realize she's sexy, right? Because if she realizes she's sexy, then like you are not in control of her. Yeah. Right. And so it's like much easier to make a very traditionally like sexy man character because there's just so much less baggage attached to that than like a sexy woman character where it's a power fantasy. Yeah.
You linked one talk that was mostly about like the Bishonen archetype in Japanese media. But she did talk a little bit, it's like a GDC talk, right?
Yeah.
She talks a little bit about like the idea of like a courtly narrative versus like a frontier narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of particularly Western video games, American video games, are sort of in this frontier narrative of like the cowboy type thing, you know, where is like a rugged man versus the environment and like survival, right? And sort of a hostile world and that sort of stuff. And in that way, by going into those narratives, the sort of rugged male hero sort of naturally emerges, right? Because we've told this sort of cultural story around them. And so there's not as many, like, we don't have as many bishonens over here, right? Which is essentially, it means like beautiful man, beautiful boy, right? But I do think that's an interesting sort of thing in talking about like the homophobia stuff, because during that era of like Japan's weird, there was also definitely a lot of Western media being like, oh, those girly Final Fantasy boys, you know?
No, absolutely. And it's, you know, interesting to the sort of like reaction to those sorts of characters now, and, you know, those characters theoretically being more appealing to like outside of the male gaze people, because they talk about this sort of like courtly love thing, both in the context of like European courts, but they were also talking about it in sort of like East Asian settings of like, this is a setting where people are expected to be refined or expected to be like polite, but also are like weaponizing their beauty and their sexuality for their own gain, right? So like Sephiroth is dressing like that on purpose.
Yeah. You know, having just finished Rebirth, I do think Final Fantasy VII is really interesting from this perspective, because for some reason a lot of popular talk about Cloud from like a more straight male perspective is like, oh man, the guy who gets all the ladies, you know, he's got all these ladies lusting after him, when Cloud is like not that. Cloud sucks at talking to women, is very like emotionally fragile, and a lot of like Rebirth especially is just him being like simultaneously like bullied and taken care of by like Aerith, Tifa, and Sephiroth, which is very interesting from like, I don't know, it's just a different sort of perspective on a like a tough male character, right? Yeah. Because he presents himself that way, but is not, in fact, able to necessarily back it up all the time. So, and I'm sure a lot of people, Sephiroth, I'm sure it was like their Sephiroth and Tifa. This is the sexual awakening of many.
Everyone's youth. Like, oh, the mummy. It's like, no.
I also think, like, the only, like, I was thinking about, okay, so, like, video game men that are, like, sexualized in sort of a similar feeling way as we do women in games. And it's Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil. Like, the...
Well, some people.
The most... Not even some people, like the very specific article I did about like his hurt voices, but like there's like
I was like, surely we're exaggerating this.
No.
And then I listened to the TikTok and I was like, oh, okay.
But like that's a subset of it. There's also just TikToks that are just like, wow, look at him when he kneels on this chain thing, you know? Yeah. Or there's like a whole, like I wrote in there, like I want someone to do like a oral history of the modded Leon Kennedy tramp stamp that has been around since like the original Resident Evil 4, right? Someone was like, he should have a belly shirt and a tramp stamp. And we as a culture were like, yeah, he probably should.
Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, there was this article on like this whole thing of like people really liking Leon's like hurt noises that he makes when he's injured, like particularly in Dead by Daylight, his version there apparently, of just finding it like not really sounding like he's in pain exactly. Which is just like fascinating because not something I think about, I guess.
Yeah, just not how I play these games.
The author of that article dropped like an extremely interesting nugget that like they didn't follow up on, of like the player and protagonist as like a BDSM sort of relationship, right? Especially in like violent games, because you can like hurt them, right, and heal them, right? And you're like in control of their actions. So I totally see where they're coming from, but you have to make that a whole blog. You can't just...
You'd be like, by the way, anyway, back to the other TikTok about Leon.
I mean, in Village, the Lady Dimitrescu stuff, I can sort of see that in a similar way, right? Because you can make Ethan go and run into her if you want to, right?
I do have to say, I think it's fascinating that team did not seem to know what they had on their hands.
Yeah.
Like, they did it by accident.
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe that. Well, someone on the team. How about this? Someone on the team knew.
Yeah.
Maybe the folks that are talking to the press didn't know. But somebody knew.
I'm sure they wanted that sort of reaction to her. I think maybe it was just the scale of it that was surprising to them, maybe. 8 feet worth of 9 feet. She's like 9 feet tall, isn't she?
Yeah, almost
9 feet tall worth of Twitter going,
mommy, mommy.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly like that. But I mean, they did talk a little bit in some of the articles I was reading about like them being surprised of like, well, they were going for a lot of the monsters in that for like a sort of like familiarity, but also like strangeness, right? So in her case, it was like she looks human, but like her extreme size, right? And these other aspects about her make her feel a little bit different or other, I guess, from the normal human form. And they do this with like dolls later too, right? And other stuff. So I do think maybe and she's like also conventionally attractive, right? She's like the Victorian lady type archetype, I guess. I don't know. What?
Her teeth aren't great.
Well, yeah. That's what I mean. Victorian lady, right?
You're right.
We think Keira Knightley's pretty, right? And she doesn't have very good teeth.
Dang, Emma's just like, let's take a random shot at Keira Knightley right now.
You wrote about Mr. Darcy in the notes, so I was thinking about
You're right, I
I
did. Where are the gaming Mr. Darcys? What's up with that? Anyway.
Where's the hand flex scene that everybody finds?
Where's the hand flex scene? I do want to, it's interesting to me that like, okay, so when a female character, I don't know, like maybe has some agency over sexuality or whatever in games, it's almost always in like a fetishy way, right? Like Bayonetta or Lady D or like any of these things. It's like, oh, like if we have a confidently sexual, I mean, whatever. I don't think Lady, how do you even say her name? I'm like
Dimitrescu, I think.
Sure. I don't want to be like, oh, actually, that character is really confident in her sexuality. I don't think that's what's going on there. But like,
she's very confident in general.
Sure. Yes. But it has to be in this, like, it's like a weird way of like, no, but like the man is sort of still in control of this because like, even if she's not just like confident, she has to be confident in like a kink way, which is like weird and bad, and not bad, but it's just like, oh, like there can't just be like a normal confident person.
Yeah. I do think sometimes people get stuck on these kinds of designs thinking like it's important to remember that the character is not a human being.
Right.
Because I feel like a lot of the time you get people being like, well, you know, she chose to wear this, right? And you can talk about that in terms of how the narrative presents it, the sort of goals that it's achieving, right? How it wants you to feel about it. But you can't just say, like, well, she picked it. Which, it's like, no, she didn't pick it. She's not a real person, you know? Or no, he didn't pick it. He's not a real person, whichever way. And I do think that's important to keep in mind when assessing designs as well, that there are goals behind it.
And I think some of that you could charitably say comes from a positive place, right? If I'm looking at a real woman's outfit, right, it's like, oh, like, she picked it.
Yeah.
Is something. And so, like, I think some of it comes from that place of, like, oh, we, like, shouldn't judge a woman by what she's wearing. And, like, good. That's good. But we can think about, like, why we are creating sexualized characters that are, like, very specifically targeted. I did also appreciate in this Waypoint radio episode I was listening to, they were talking about how, like the guys on the show were talking about how, like, you know, they're, like, dads now, right? Like, adult people. And this is not the, like, my daughter, so now I understand this. But he was like, they were both like, the male gaze having to always be a male Lear, like being assumed to be a male Lear or a teenage boy Lear, really. Like, that's something that, well, like, on one hand, like, okay, that's a thing, and like, maybe it cannot bother you, like, intellectually exactly, that the fact that, like, when they were playing games like that, it felt like, oh, like, the creator thinks I want to engage with the game this way. And that's, like, you know, a death of the author, I guess, to some extent, right? But, like, that changes maybe, like, if you're realizing, oh, the creator expects me to be leering at this, like, that changes your relationship with the work, potentially.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole idea of, like, male gaze in particular. I skimmed through some stuff that wasn't totally relevant to this because it was more broad, but, like, this blog post on the gamer gaze.
Oh, yeah. That one I have open but didn't actually read, so yeah, I'm glad you skimmed it.
But it is really interesting to think about it in terms of, like, the player's relationship to the character they're playing and the different ways you can manipulate the camera, and the way that, because you can manipulate the camera when the camera's manipulated for you, there's still some connection there, right? So there's much more, like, it's I think harder to separate, like, a character gazing at someone in a particular way and how you need to be gazing at someone. The talk you linked also talked a little bit about, like, different scenes in Mass Effect, and, like, some scenes where it's clear that, like, Shepard is looking, right? Yeah. And feeling something about the way that they're looking at the romantic partner that they're interested in. And sometimes the camera's just like, look at this girl's butt.
Yeah.
And you just have to, I think especially in games, because of the sort of nebulous the BDSM going on, you know.
Let's look forward to that for Emma's next side quest.
The idea of gaze was even more, like, fraught, I think.
And, like, it's okay for characters to have nice butts that you want to look at. Yeah. Like, that's fine. Clearly that's not how Emma and I play games, I guess. But, like, that I want to say that it's, like, we're talking about this, like, sexualization, but, like, it's fine. It's fine that the camera looks at the butt sometimes. It's just, like, why and when, and, like, what is that? What is that saying, and why?
Yeah.
And, you know, let's talk a little bit about, like, more positive examples, I guess. I feel like where we're starting to see more representation, or different people feeling like, yes, I want to bang that character. I feel like almost all these games, though, are like, here's a menu of people, right? Like Hades, Baldur's Gate, like that sort of thing. It's like, oh, like here's a menu. And like there are different it's interesting to me. It's like we're not yet at the point where it's like, no. Like we're just gonna have a game about Dusa, right? Or
Sure.
I don't know, like pick your unlikely sex symbol of your choice from one of these games, and it's not just going to be like that's going to be the character. It's like you get to choose.
Yeah. Well, you know, Baldur's Gate and Mass Effect and that sort of stuff is sort of beholden to the you're the player and you're the protagonist sort of thing, right? So they're offering various options because that's part of the player expressing, you know, their desires onto the world, in not just in romance ways, but in all the various decisions you can make in those games. Mm-hmm. Hades, I feel like, is slightly different because you can't date everyone in Hades.
That's true.
Right? The people you can date, you can all date at the same time because they're gods, right? They're not so worried about that. As long as they can communicate healthily about their polyamorous situation. But, you know, you can't date everyone in that. There's someone said Thagrius. Thagrius is only interested in a select few of that menu, right? And only a select few are interested in Zagreus. So even though everyone's hot, it's not necessarily for, like, the player to enact their desire upon which character they find sexy upon Zagreus, right?
That's true, but I still think that, like, you're right about the dating element. I still think that Hades is very much a, like, you know, we know that you, the player, are looking, and here's your menu.
Sure.
Kind of thing. Which is fine and good. I just think it's notable that these games that are doing things that are different aren't ready to be like, no. Like, here's my weird thing, and you're gonna play a whole game about my weird thing.
To be fair, I do think we haven't really talked about, like, dating specific games, right? Because we did a podcast on relationship systems, and talking about, like, dating games too is like could be like its whole own thing. But yeah. I bet if you got really deep into, like, Otome games, sure, you would find some weird stuff.
I don't think you'd have to get that deep, to be honest. But yeah.
So I'm sure there's stuff out there. I think just talking about, like, more mainstream core gaming experiences, though, I agree. I just generally don't love having choices.
Just personally.
I would rather play a romance between two different characters where I happen to control one of them than I would, like, be like, yes, I want to date Shadowheart or whatever, you know.
Well, I mean, I think that comes from the, like, I don't think you really play games as self-insert very much.
No, not really.
Like, or at all. And so, yeah, like, then it just becomes like who do I think this, like, it just becomes a more, like, intense improv, or more intense, like, what is my character sheet here? Which, you know, makes sense.
I do think, you talked a little bit, you mentioned, like, how much of the idea of Hades being sexy comes from, like, the writing, too.
Yeah.
But I think that's actually an important thing to bear in mind if you're trying to make a character that people will find sexy, is it's not just about the way that they look, right? People are still writing horny fan fiction about Final Fantasy VII characters from when they were polygons, because not only were they, like, pretty and, you know, sexy, but because they liked them, right? And I guess this is just, like, a general character design tip, too. If you want your characters to have staying power, they should be good characters, right? So, yes, I think that a lot of, like, the sexiness of Hades is also in, like, how the characters are written. But, like, yeah, of course it is, right? You can't just like throw a woman in a revealing outfit at me, and like maybe if I was a teenage boy, I'd be like, yeah, hot, but then I'm moving on to the next hot lady, right? Stuff like Hades, Final Fantasy VII, Baldur's Gate, they have staying power because people like the characters in addition to liking the way the characters look, right?
Well, I think that's why it's all the weirdos who are iconic, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, that also comes back to a, like, restrictive and harmful and harms everybody, like, view of, like, what it is to be, like, sexually attractive to a, like, teenage straight man. Which is, like, yeah, like, that girl is not interesting, right? She's, like, there for the dude. She's there for you. She doesn't, like, have her own thing. And I'm not saying this to be like, all men feel this way. They don't. I'd say, like, the overwhelming majority of them, this would be, like, not be what they would pick. But, like, this cultural story that we've told ourselves of, like, this woman who is, like, pretty much just there to, like, service you and lift you up and whatever. Like, that's not a very interesting character. And even if you think it is an interesting character, it's a character that, by necessity, can't stand out.
Yeah.
So that's why everybody likes the fish man.
Yeah.
And the mean Baldur's Gate guy.
Yeah, exactly.
I like a mean video. I like a I can fix him game character.
Asterian's for you.
Apparently. I'll get to it someday.
Yeah, so, well, anything else?
I'll throw in my mandatory like a dragon comment. So I submit 2 video clips for analysis, listeners. 1, you're gonna go to YouTube. You're gonna type in Kiryu shower scene. There's a 0. And I think this scene is a really perfect example of how, like, men are not sexualized in the same way as women would definitely be. Like, the YouTube, don't ignore the YouTube comments.
Yeah.
Like, they're thirsty for it. But, like, I'm thinking of, like, what would a woman showering in this way, even if she's as depressed as Kiryu is in the scene, look like? It's like, oh, we would not be as close shot in on the side view, right? We'd get a much, like, let's see the figure kind of shot. And then, like, the back view, I think, is doing more to be like, actually, this man looks skinny. I
feel like it's also more about, like, the iconic, right? The tattoo, right? I will say the scene in the not to get into spoilers too much, but the ending, the Kiryu ending in Infinite Wealth, where he's, like, straddling the guy.
I know.
Who's that for?
That's for the girls.
That's for the girls, I guess.
Oh, no. There is a vocal, like, I mean, you know, the Yakuza fanfiction is homoerotic almost exclusively, right? So, like, you know, like, that's who it's for. Or it's not. They probably don't even know that.
The Majima Everywhere system in Kiwami implies that they know at least a little bit.
You're right, that they know. Meanwhile, second one to submit for consideration is the passionate manly bathhouse battle as it's referenced in 0 or 1, I think, in Ishin, where the 2 dragons fight fully in the nude.
The really bright smoke on their crotch is extremely funny.
It just follows
like
them
the
everywhere.
Holy light.
There is like a one of them spanks the other heat action.
Good.
Which, like, yeah, it's like, so this I guess I'll say, like, you might think, like, oh, like, that's for the girls.
Yeah, but
right? No, it's not. Male nudity is like for comedy always.
Yeah.
So Like, that's another thing. It's like, even in situations where it's like, oh, like, there it is. Like they're being sexualized in the same way. It's for laughs.
Yeah.
You could not, like, a passionate feminine bathhouse battle is like...
would be quite different. I mean, Yakuza has the...
the bug ladies.
The bug ladies, yeah. Which is essentially that, but very different.
Yeah. No, it's the... Whenever we were watching anime, we're like, oh, girly bath time. It's that.
Sometimes the boys have bath time, sometimes, you know.
They do, but it's not the same as girly bath time.
I'll also say, you know, in Stellar Blade's defense, I do like playing dress up in video games.
Yeah.
And isn't that me just enacting, like, my own desires upon the character I'm playing when I make them wear funny sunglasses? You know.
Yeah.
Would they wear this? No, but it is very funny for them to wear the funny sunglasses.
You're right. You are enforcing just as unrealistic standards on these characters.
Yeah.
One closing hot take, really, that you made, and I'm just going to parrot it. The Genshin Impact characters do not have butts.
Every once in a while I see on Twitter from, like, just a random Genshin fan that finds its way in front of me that's like, man, look at this guy's butt. And it's like, they're using the same skeleton for all these men. None of them have butts.
Which, look, that's fine. You don't have to have a butt to be sexy, but, like, let's not pretend.
Yeah. Don't call them daddy. None of the Genshin Impact characters are that.
Emma's really enforcing her own, like, opinions on it. Emma's like, we're like, anybody
Those
can think this, but not this.
Scientifically classified as twinks, okay?
Well,
please learn your classifications and terminologies before talking about characters.
Please. Well, on that note, I think that's as good a place to end as any. Listeners, thanks for tuning in for another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Do you have a sexy video game character that we didn't talk about here? What's your, like, well, some people do character? Do you think the Hades 2 designs are... Emma thinks the Hades 2 designs, some of them are worse. Do you think they're worse? What else? Did you look at that Unicorn Overlord character? How do you feel about the boobs there? They're really weird. Like, sorry. Like, you actually don't tell us that, because the answer to that is, like, they're weird.
They're weird.
Have you seen good examples of games that are where, like, the female characters have, like, sexy, sexualized agency, but they aren't, like, dominatrix coded? If you have thoughts on this, do you enjoy the male gaze? Do you actually want to come in here and be like, actually, male gaze good? If you have thoughts on this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website at www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend and Split Screen. I did put out a call on my Instagram story for, like, who do people think are the sexiest game characters? And somebody said, oh, the white-haired guy from Kingdom Hearts. Which one do we think that is?
I don't know.
Comb through the Clickbait Boyfriend archives, people, and
do you think decide. It's just Sephiroth?
From, like, Olympus Coliseum. Like, what other, like, totally inappropriate white-haired guys from Kingdom Hearts can I think of? Anyway. Right. But the most important thing, when you've finished contemplating that, is that you should subscribe to the show. We're on Apple Podcasts. Tune in. Wait. Sorry, let's try again. I'm still getting the new cadence into my head. I really need to figure out YouTube Music so I can, like, plug it in and I don't have to mess up my lines so much. Yeah. So, like, please do subscribe on Apple Podcasts. TuneIn, Spotify. Sorry, we're still learning. Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app. Overcast, Pocket Cast, wherever you find podcasts. Subscribe to Talk This. This coming week, I don't remember what we're talking about, even a little bit.
Sly Cooper is the old game. I think the new game was Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. But I will double check that.
Here's a question for you all listeners. Sly Cooper?
Should we hear you out?
He does not... I'm looking at the character design. Not really wearing pants.
Great.
We'll circle back to that next week. But then in 2 weeks, it'll be our 6 weeks in gaming. We're like, oh my god, I have to play some games. Help me. I'm so overwhelmed by the games.
Well, Madelyn, will you sign us out for this week?
How do I even... Like, what is even the way to sign this off? Okay. This week, I hope that you find fan edits of your favorite character modded with a tramp stamp.